Iconic Masters draft archetypes and statistics, let's dive right into it. The three main themes of the set are non-creature prowess, mid-range creatures and combos, and ramp. Now, this is the point where I normally list off the specific archetypes by color combination, but Iconic Masters is a bit different from typical draft sets in that the color boundaries aren't as clear-cut. The exception in the set is blue-black mill, in that typical draft archetypes are like this one. They're two colors, a very clear goal, and not an extensive amount of variation. And if we look back at the archetypes of a recent set like Amonkhet, we see that like blue-black mill, they are pretty clear-cut when it comes to which colors to run. But now if we look at an Iconic Masters theme such as ramp, we'll be able to see why the set's a bit different with its color combinations. We do see quite a bit of green ramp, and having ramp primarily in green is pretty normal, but notice the white wiener on the right. That represents artifacts, as there are actually 9 artifacts for ramp in Iconic Masters. And having so many artifact ramp cards means that you can turn any color combination into a ramp deck. And that includes some unusual ramp color combinations like red-white. Another example where Iconic Masters blurs the color lines is with evasion. We normally see evasion dominated by blue and white, and if we look back at Amonkhet, we see just that. But in Iconic Masters, we see evasion is much more scattered across the colors, with both black and red having an unusually high amount of evasion. So while offense-defense evasion decks are typically reserved for blue, just like with ramp, now you can make an evasion deck with pretty much any color combination. But just because the color boundaries aren't well defined doesn't mean we shouldn't build decks with synergy. So within each of the 3 themes, let's look at each sub-theme or archetype. Let's start by looking within the Prowess theme. Notice that it's dominated by Jeskai colors, so white, red, and blue, but like with ramp and evasion, pretty much any color combination will do. Although if you want to make a really aggressive Prowess deck, then you'll want to stick in red, and much of that has to do with these 2 cards, Kiln Fiend and Monastery Swiftspear. And more Kiln Fiend than Monastery, because if you play Pauper, you know just how powerful Kiln Fiend can be, especially when you combo it with these rebound cards that cost 1. So if you want to build an aggro deck in this set, you really got to go red, and you got to go for Kiln Fiend, just because for aggro to stand a chance, you really need to be super aggressive, because with all this ramp in the set, you really got to finish them off before they get their big creatures out, because once those big creatures are out, it's going to be really, really hard to win. And out of all the aggro prowess decks out there, probably red-white's going to be the dominant one, or rather, it's the easiest one to pull off, although any color combination could work. But I do think that red-white aggro has an edge just because it can respond to some creature removal things out there, because creature removal is going to give this deck a hard time. So keep that in mind. Also within the prowess theme, we have some slower prowess decks like blue-white prowess and blue-red prowess, which has some pretty good value late game. But just remember that these slower decks will have to compete with the ramp decks out there, and with so many bomb creatures in the set, you really have to have a solid blue-red prowess deck or a blue-white prowess deck to compete with them. But enough prowess talk, let's move on to mid-range. The main archetypes that stand out in the mid-range theme are life gain, +1/+1 counters, and blue-black mill. There are a few more mid-range archetypes out there, but it mostly boils down to +1/+1 counters and life gain. Starting with life gain, you'll notice that it's black-white dominant, and there are quite a few cards out there to support this archetype. But as cool as this archetype is, I do gotta warn people that it's really, really hard to pull off, in that you either have the key cards or you don't. And if you don't have the key cards, well, the deck really isn't gonna work out that well. For those of you that played Ixalan, it's kind of like the vampire archetype, and that one was also black-white, where like you had the lords or you didn't, and if you didn't have the lords to support the vampires, then it just kind of fell apart. So for Iconic Masters, if you pick up some key life gain cards early, then sure, go life gain, but just be cautious with it because it's really hard to pull off. Next is +1/+1 counters. It's a pretty deep archetype. There's a lot of cards out there to support it. You'll have the most options if you stick in the Abzan colors, mostly green, but unfortunately, like the life gain archetype, I do have to warn that this archetype is going to be also hard to pull off, in that yes, there's a lot of synergy within the archetype, but with so much creature removal out there and counter, it's hard to get these synergy payoffs to work. And not only is there a lot of removal out there, but there's a lot of good removal. There's Supreme Verdict, there's Anger of the Gods, all these cards that can totally decimate your mid-range creatures. So to me, mid-range kind of feels like a no man's zone, where like you have the aggro decks, you have the ramp decks, and mid-range is kind of like in this weird position, because if the mid-range deck takes too long to go off, then it's going to be competing with these ramp decks, and these ramp decks have access to some insane stuff. So mid-range is going to be tough to pull off. The last mid-range archetype to mention is blue-black mill, and blue-black mill gets a lot of attention whenever it's a draft archetype in a set, but just like in Hour of Devastation and Shadows for Innistrad, mill can work, but it's going to be really hard to make it work. I mean, we're talking like pack 1, glimpse the unthinkable, and hope you get a second one. But on the bright side, we do have Grizzly's Spectacle in the set. It's a common, and it has the potential to mill your opponent for a lot. So mill could work, and even if you don't have enough cards to mill your opponent entirely, there's always Jace's Phantasm to finish your opponent off, and it's pretty good as a 5/5 flyer for 1, and it's a common. So yes, there is still hope for blue-black mill and Iconic Masters, but I probably wouldn't go this route unless I pull Glimpse the Unthinkable pack 1, or see it somewhere in pack 1 being passed around, because there are definitely a lot easier archetypes to pull off, like ramp decks. And before we get into ramp, I do want to mention defenders, because I know a lot of people are going to point out that defenders could be an archetype in the set, and to that I say no. Just no. Now, I will say there's quite a bit of good synergy between defenders, especially with Overgrown Battlement, but if someone makes a deck that's purely defenders and they expect to win with Assault formation, that's going to be quite difficult to do. One, because Assault formation is good in any deck, regardless of whether or not they have defenders, so you'll probably only be able to pick up one Assault formation for your deck, and even if you do get it, relying on one card to win you the game is a bit tough, especially since there's enchantment removal in the set. So just defender deck deck, not that great. If you happen to have a lot of defenders in your deck, that's great, that's fine. You can be offense, defense, but purely defenders, no. But finally, moving on to ramp. Ramp is going to be the big theme in this set. And like I said, pretty much any color combination can work with ramp. And with so many bombs out there, the ramp decks are gonna be pretty gangster. Now, within the ramp theme, there's about 3 different types. The first one is just plain and simple, pure ramp. It only has ramp cards and it has payoff cards and nothing really in between. It just hopes to get to late game as soon as possible without interacting with your opponent at all. And as long as the people at your draft pod don't have anything too good, this form of ramp will be pretty consistent. But probably a safer way to use ramp, make a ramp deck with creature removal and also ramp cards. That way you can delay your opponent by getting rid of their creatures and surviving until late game. Alternatively, you could also use counter to get to late game. So basically just counter your opponent's stuff, survive until late game, and once you're in late game, just drop a bunch of bombs, and that works too. So overall, I think the ramp decks in Iconic Masters are going to dominate the set simply because it's just so easy to pull off. You can pretty much pick any bomb card in pack 1, support it with a bunch of artifact ramp cards, and it's going to be a pretty consistent way because you don't have to commit to any colors at any point. I mean, you can just switch into like a third color pack 3 and it's totally fine because your deck's so flexible and you have so much mana fixing. And with so many multicolored lands out there, you could just make like a 3-4 color deck and that's totally fine. The last thing I want to mention though is dragons, because there is quite a bit of dragon synergy in the set. Dragons is primarily red, but you can find support for it in all 5 colors and even colorless. But you'll find that black-red decks will have the most support for dragons, and if the dragon deck gets the right cards, it can be quite good. The only word of caution I have for the deck is that it's a lot easier to build a generic ramp deck than it is to build a dragon deck. Like for example, if you look at Dragon Lord's Servant, yes, it helps you ramp into your dragons, but compare that to Wall of Roots. Wall of Roots basically does the same thing because you're probably not going to play more than 1 dragon a turn, but it's a better blocker and you can make mana on your opponent's turn. So my advice would be to lean towards a generic ramp deck, and if you happen to get a lot of dragon synergy, then you can lean that way, but a fully committed dragon deck will lose some of that flexibility that generic ramp has. So just keep that in mind. But on the other hand, how often do you get to draft a dragon deck? So maybe you just want to make a pure dragon deck just for fun, and that's cool too. But there's still a lot more Iconic Master stuff to talk about, particularly with combos, because there are quite a few combos in this set. So I'll post a combo video right away. And if you don't want to miss the video, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I wish you the best of luck when drafting Iconic Masters.